The Baroque period. An era of drama, exuberance, and directness. Art was shifting from a focus on realism to emotional output. The architecture at this time was also feeling this impact. Just look at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. I mean, this thing is just breathtaking. This extraordinary focus on emotional output defined the Baroque period, and it heavily affected music too. Composers of this time were starting to abandon the ubiquitous use of word painting and polyphony that was common in the Renaissance for a newer focus on voice leading within chords, combined with letting lyrics control emotional output. Yes? Hey, isn't that like the same thing? The Baroque period is commonly considered to be between 1600 and 1750, starting from a group of Catholics declaring a counter-reformation against the Protestants, driven by an attempt to spread faith through emotional art and architecture. One of the musical pioneers of this counter-reformation was William Byrd, who was considered one of England's greatest composers of the time. His work is known for its expressiveness in sacred music and sophisticated nature in secular form. This man was creatively fueled purely by his love for God and hate for Protestants. Let's take a look at one of his later works, Constant Penelope. This writing is very different from the writing of the Renaissance. Even with the heavy polyphonic influence, there is a clear sense of progression that wasn't super present in previous writing. There are also many modulations and applied dominance, showing a clear understanding of the theoretical maximum of the time. If you've watched my other two music history videos, you've definitely heard me talk about the dominant-tonic relationship between the 5 and 1 chord in a key. These two chords have a very strong sense of tension and release that is highly sought after in composing. The only issue is that there's only one real instance you can use it in, which is when resolving to the 1 chord. To combat this, composers of this time, like Byrd, started experimenting with what we now call applied dominance. Let's take a look at this set of chords at measure 48. This second chord has the notes C, E, and G, making it a very clear C major. In the piece's home key of G Dorian, this is a diatonic 4 chord, so nothing special here. However, looking at the chord before, it features G, D, and the non-diatonic B natural. This makes it a G major chord, which is not diatonic to our home key. G major is diatonic to C major though, where it functions as a 5 chord. What Byrd was actually doing here was applying a dominant chord from a different key to spice up the progression with some extra tension. Applied dominants are a super important part of tonal harmony today, especially in jazz music. Another prominent early Baroque composer was Claudio Monteverdi, who focused his work on defining Seconda pratica. This was a new form of polyphony defined by its emphasis on the bass and soprano voices and its increased freedom in dissonance usage. To get an idea of what he was working on, let's take a listen to
O mirtillo, mirtillo anima mia.
As we can see, there is definitely more emphasis on making the soprano and bass parts feel more melodic than the interior voices, similar to some of today's choral music. If I had to guess why this started occurring, it's likely because our ears tend to hear the outer voices more clearly than inner voices, meaning writing beautiful melodic lines for interior voices was kind of a waste of time. This was a huge step towards the monophonic music that is more popular today, as before this, most music was polyphonic, more concerned with melodic content than harmonic. Moving into the middle of the Baroque, music was starting to become exclusively related to large-scale events, with the prominent genres being church music and opera. If only there was a way to play some music in a small group of friends, without all the hassle of large projects. Introducing chamber music. Now you and your friends can practice and perform beautiful works of art in the comfort of your own home. Jokes aside, I love chamber music. There's something so special about the small group dynamic and having complete instrumentation with just a handful of people. I'm not surprised composers of the Baroque started to write in this style. One extremely prominent artist of this time was Arcangelo Corelli, who was extremely versed in the writing of the newly developed Trio Sonata. Let's take a listen to his Trio Sonata in C major, Opus 4, number 1. Those of you with a good ear may have noticed something off about this piece. The title is Trio Sonata, but there are actually 4 musicians required to perform this piece. The score has 3 staves for the 3 string instruments, but the keyboardist reads the bottom staff combined with these little numbers below. These numbers are called basso continuo, or more modernly, figured bass. Its purpose is to tell the keyboardist what intervals to play over a specific note. Certain combination of numbers can be used to represent chord inversions, suspensions, alterations, etc. Realizing figured bass was one of the first examples of improvisation in music, and is comparable to playing off of tabs or a lead sheet today. Corelli's writing mastery was not confined to Rome, however. He was one of the first composers to have widespread fame based solely on his instrumental music, noted to have inspired composers such as Bach, Handel, Vivaldi. After listening to both Vivaldi's and Corelli's compositions, the influence that the latter had on the former couldn't be clearer. Vivaldi pretty much took what Corelli worked on and stretched it to its max, including writing multiple trio sonatas, as well as his Foglia cycle, inspired by Corelli's own piece called Foglia. On top of this, his use of chromaticism, ostinato, and syncopation were unmatched at the time. As much as I'd like to look at Winter, we've all heard that piece enough, so here's Vivaldi's Concerto in D minor, Opus 8, number 9. I mean, what can I even say? This writing is just incredible. Let's take a look at those terms I mentioned earlier. First is chromaticism, which is the use of the chromatic scale. Modern scales only use 7 notes, which creates the distinct patterns of tones and semitones that give them their characteristics. For example, a major scale has semitones between its 3rd and 4th degrees and between its 7th and 1st. These characteristics create the different moods or vibes for each scale. The chromatic scale, however, is different. It uses all 12 notes, leaving no room for whole tone steps, and usually creates dissonance against the harmonic backing. Vivaldi gets around this by having the 3 violins fall down the chromatic scale in unison with no harmonic backing, creating a lot of tension and uncertainty. Next is ostinato, which is a repeating pattern of notes that usually creates an interesting texture underneath the melody. Ostinato is present in the basso continuo part of this piece. Even though the exact notes aren't the same every time, the contour is similar enough to reasonably call this pattern ostinato. And lastly, we have syncopation, which is probably the simplest idea out of the 3. You see how the upper strings emphasize offbeats, whereas the lower strings target the onbeats? That's called syncopation. It can get more complicated than that, but not in the Baroque era. The last composer we will be looking at today is Bach, but we won't be listening to any of his music. Instead, we're going to look at how Bach was the catalyst for how all music sounds today. As of now, the average keyboard instrument is tuned to a system called A440 12 tet. I know that looks like a bunch of gibberish, but I'll help break it down. A440 refers to the fact that A has a pitch of 440 Hz. This is only for standardization. It could have reasonably been any number around here. After this is 12 tet, which is 12 tone equal temperament. This means that every note in an octave is perfectly spaced so that each semitone sounds the same. This leads to every key sounding the same, but none of them being perfect. If you want more information on this, check out the video I've linked in the description. It does a much better job at explaining than I can do here. This is not always the way keyboards were tuned, however. Before Bach came around, the common temperament system was called mean tone tuning, which prioritized keeping as many pure major thirds as possible. What this resulted in was a system that sounded great in some keys, but terrible in others. Instead of today's system, where almost every note is a tiny bit off, this system had most of the notes being perfect, but some being way out of whack. Specifically, the fifth between A flat and E flat was around 1/3 of a semitone sharper than the rest of the fifths. Here's what that sounds like. Bach was not a fan of this, so he started using a system called well temperament. His goal was simple, to popularize a temperament system where all keys could sound good. Unfortunately, he didn't actually write down exactly how to use well temperament, but musicologists have decoded a cryptic visual scribbled on Bach's book containing pieces for this system. Here's what that looks like. I know this just looks like a bunch of scribbles, but apparently there's a meaning to it. According to the graphic, Bach wanted the fifths F to C to G to D to A to E to be slightly flat, E to B to F sharp to C sharp to be pure, and C sharp, G sharp, D sharp, A sharp to also be slightly flat, but not as much as the naturals. This leaves the fifth between A sharp and F to be slightly sharp, but not nearly as bad as the previous system. And with that, we have reached the end of today's video and the end of this mini-series. I do plan to continue uploading music theory videos similar to these three, so if you enjoyed, please consider subscribing to catch those. Now if you excuse me, I have some more harpsichord tunes to learn.